Bonjour. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jeff Laux. I'm pleased to act as your host or facilitator for this morning's webinar. My apologies for the delay getting started. Like all good things that we try to do, it never goes off without some kind of a little technical glitch every now and then. And that is what has happened this morning, and I apologize for the delay in getting us going. We are joined today from around British Columbia and across Canada. And as I've said before, although the First Nations Housing and Infrastructure Council offices are located on the traditional and unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, in particular the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam First Nations, we are joined today through the wonders of technology that sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. So hopefully we've got some of the kinks settled, and we're now ready to get going. In order to do that, we want to start today in a good way. And as has happened before, Doug Harris has agreed to do that for us. And Doug, if I can turn it over to you, I'd ask you to start us off today in a good way. And I think something has happened because I've lost Doug. So would the wizard behind the curtain please tell me what's going on?
We're having a few technical glitches this morning. I blame the end of August and the start of September for that. So we'll have to proceed without Doug today.
Okay, then again, I know that Doug was around and Doug was trying to get on. So I'm going to thank him anyways for wanting to be here and wanting to start us off that way. And we hope that we can maybe connect with him and get him started later on. Okay, so let's get going. This session today has actually two large components built into it. One is on the discussion around housing for those who live away from the nation. Sometimes we have a tendency to call that urban housing, but obviously we know that not everybody who lives away from the community is living in urban settings. So that session will be a large discussion, hopefully, around how we harmonize both on and off reserve housing, and how we make this process work, and the role that the new authority could hopefully play in that. The other part of the session is about infrastructure, and we talked a little bit about infrastructure on the last webinar. We're going to touch on it again today. Now, initially what we had planned to do, if you were looking at the agenda for this morning, we were going to do the urban session, or the housing away session first with Michael Sadler. Somehow we've lost Michael too in the ether, and we're not sure where he is, but hopefully he will connect. So what we're going to do is flip the discussion. What we're going to do is flip the discussion. Is that Michael I hear?
That's Doug.
No, it's Doug. Okay,
sorry.
just 1 second, Doug. We'll be right to you. So we're going to flip the conversation with Michael and with our other two guests this morning, Kear, Porttris, and Heather Leong. And doing that, Dr. Carrie Black will take on hosting the session for that part of the conversation, and we'll ask Carrie to facilitate that discussion and ask a variety of questions, etc., and have that conversation with both Kear and Heather. Carrie, for those of you who know, is one of the senior advisors with us on the First Nations Housing and Infrastructure Council. Also on staff as a professor at the University of Calgary, and well-versed in both infrastructure, water, and all of those various particular issues, and someone who's been around this game for a long time. So we'll do that. We'll start with that first. But seeing as Doug has joined us, I'm going to take advantage of this. And Doug, we've been having technical glitches, so I'm hoping that your song and prayer work those out for us. Please go ahead.
Good morning, Jeff. Good morning, everybody. I apologize. Technical difficulties, yes. I squeal muckswait. No wheel muckswait. Height sapka. I'd sapka, a ton of quail. I see him na San Juan, na see ya, na Eli Schwatlaqua, I'd sapka. Quashialip, a ton of quail. I yatzelt, eat watzelt. I'd sapka. See, we sensei. See, we sensei. See, we sensei. Nicht kann oh, see a ton of quail. Three me tall, a ton of quail. Eat a muck square. Scotland stuff. Heitzepka. Back to you, Jeff.
Thank you, Doug, and I appreciate you for coming on and doing that for us. Okay, so we'll turn things over here to Carrie in just a second. I just wanted to remind folks of some of the housekeeping things as to how that works. We will, at the bottom of your screen, you will see a Q&A section there. If you would, as we go along through the morning and you have questions you wish to ask, please post them to the Q&A section. I'll be monitoring it, and we'll try to make sure that as we finish the sections, we'll come back to the Q&A. We've set aside a fair amount of time at the end to be able to do that. We expect that because of the nature of the two sessions, there'll be a fair amount of questions. So please be patient. We'll try to work through them all. Anything that we don't get to this morning, and I'll remind you again at the end of this, anything that we don't get to this morning, we will post to the website and we will answer your questions. So it's just, we'll try to get to as many as we can in the time that we have. So without taking up too much more time, I'm going to turn it over to Carrie to introduce both Kear and Heather. I'll let you do the bios, Carrie, and do all of that and start things off. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff. Good morning, everyone. I am joining you from the traditional territory of the people of Treaty 7, and it's my honor to be on today's webinar. Apologies for a few little technical glitches there. This is webinar number 5, and we've ironed out most of those technical glitches, but it's September and not everybody's ready to get a head start on this new school year, so including perhaps some of our computers. So today we're going to jump into infrastructure, and the nature of today's webinar is really meant to tackle some of the difficult topics that have arisen over the past couple of years in our engagement. The first one being urban housing, First Nations living away from home, and the second one is infrastructure. Now, over the past 2 years, we've talked about infrastructure in great detail at every single one of our engagement sessions. What do we mean by infrastructure? What do we talk about when we talk about infrastructure as part of a new authority? Do we mean everything? Do we mean the whole kit and caboodle in the kitchen sink? There's no shortage of questions that arise at every single engagement session around infrastructure. What we wanted to do today was to bring a few different voices and perspectives forward. And so joining us today, we have Heather Leong. Heather is has worked for the federal government for 25 years, initially with Health Canada, before moving over to Indigenous Services Canada. She's worked in various directorates in Indigenous Services Canada, including funding services, specific claims, and community infrastructure. Originally from Alberta, though we will not hold that against her, Heather has a Bachelor of Arts degree in economics from the University of Calgary and holds a general management certificate from the Sadler School of Business. Good morning, Heather.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you.
Also joining us today is Kear Porttris. He's an Indigenous Engineering and Relationship Manager and Principal at Gwaii Engineering. Gwaii is an Indigenous civil and environmental engineering firm focused on working with Indigenous and First Nations communities in BC, working to design and build infrastructure that maximize benefit to communities. He's passionate about increasing Indigenous representation in science, technology, engineering, and math, and supports capacity building on design and construction projects that Gwaii is involved with. Good morning, Kear.
Morning.
So what we wanted to talk about today is infrastructure. And obviously everyone has a different perspective about what that means. And so what I wanted to start with first was to give you a bit of sense about the kinds of conversations that we've been having at FNHIC over the past couple of years around infrastructure. Now, the topics have been far-ranging, from whether it's something small, a small community water system, large, massive infrastructure projects. A lot of the conversations have centered around funding, the amount of funding required for these infrastructure projects in BC First Nations. BC has a unique situation in that it has a lot of small communities, a lot of communities with less than 100 people, less than 200 people, and a lot of remote communities, which makes large-scale infrastructure projects really difficult. So a lot of the questions have centered around funding and finance, have centered around how we're going to deal with the massive infrastructure gap that exists. We know that the federal government has committed to closing the infrastructure gap by 2030, but we also know that infrastructure is a huge issue in non-Indigenous communities. And so that, given that it's a huge issue in non-Indigenous communities, the gap is that much greater in First Nations communities. So the first thing I wanted to do is just get your perspectives and thoughts on where you think the biggest challenges are with respect to infrastructure in First Nations communities, specifically here in BC. So Heather, maybe I'll start with you.
Sure, thank you. And I just want to also acknowledge the territory that we're on, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh. So just jumping right into it, being with the federal government, it is very obvious that we don't have all the answers to everything, and we're very limited by a lot of processes and budgets and whatnot. So we're hoping that, you know, this investigation of the First Nations-led organization will help determine, you know, some of the path forward. So in our opinion, you know, there's three major challenges that we go through. The first one is differing priorities. And while we would all kind of not disagree with that water and safe drinking water and housing are key priorities, it's very different within every First Nation. So as Carrie says, you know, with 200 First Nations, if you have good, clean drinking water and you have sufficient housing, there's a whole range of infrastructure that is still a priority and that there's very limited budgets for. The second biggest one is timing. So, you know, the federal government has annual budgets. You know, the infamous March 31st deadline is always the killer for us. And so how do we plan infrastructure projects that may take several years and commit money to specific projects when we're not sure of next year's budgets, or we're not sure of like 2 or 3 years worth of budgets? So that's a very difficult for us to overcome, per se. And the third one, probably related to the first two, is the whole piece about chasing the money. You know, when there's these short-term, very specific programs or that only deal with specific areas, that's where First Nations may want to focus just to get some infrastructure into the community, but they may not be necessarily what they need. For example, when we first rolled out the housing budget in 2016, emphasis was on multiplexes. And here in BC, that wasn't something traditionally what communities needed. So, but, you know, in order to get new housing units, that's where they focus on. So, you know, those are kind of those really high level pieces that if we could, you know, change some of those, some of the smaller details will also, you know, be able to change to address that.
Thanks, Heather. Kear, maybe I'll turn it over to you to get your perspectives about some of the challenges, and then we'll have a quick back and forth about it.
Yeah, thanks, Carrie. And lots of good lessons learned or input from you, Heather. One of the things that we found working with a lot of First Nations is actually access to, I guess, technical information around the infrastructure, I think, is a big one. So, you know, some communities that we know have a scattering of their drawings or their infrastructure information all over the place. So just understanding, you know, the importance, maybe even with like a drawing file opposed to a PDF, right? So as you know, as consultants, yeah, we can create drawing files for you, but the way that contracts or the way that information is shared between consultants and the community often is not consistent. So just keeping in mind that, you know, how important that information is from your different projects that you have, because I think we've all seen almost like a patchwork of standards that are used over the years with communities, not, you know, not really knowing what infrastructure they do have, or the information that they have around their infrastructure may not be correct. So I think one of the things that we are trying to work towards is just trying to have, you know, just understand the information within your community, one, but also understand, you know, the standards that you might want to build it on, right? So you might want to build it on MMCD, which is very common in private or in sort of private industry to say, yeah, here's your standards. This is our standard contract. These are, and why those things are important, or maybe even creating your own standards or making changes to some of those things, so you know it fits what's in your community, right? It's about fitting the need rather than just, oh, you know, we just, like Heather's saying, right, oh, this one funding program's in, so we're going to do it this way, but then you have to figure out how that fits into the next infrastructure project, so it's not you know, like totally oversized or undersized, right? Because that is a lot of those challenges there. Another challenge that I've seen is maybe not a total understanding, or there's a gap in understanding between the bureaucracy of the funding cycle, I think, with a lot of what ISK does, right? So, you know, at the end of September, ISK likes to have all their regional projects together so they can start looking at what it looks like in the coming year. And I'm not, you know, some of the communities we work with don't quite understand how that bureaucratic or that sort of strategic planning starts at that level. And you know, we're able to help and support that and work with communities and ISK in the ways that can make that possible. But I think that's something where we've run into a lot where communities are just, you know, they either don't have it within their band office or their capacity just isn't there yet. But I think understanding how the funding cycle and kind of getting that money, like Heather was saying, works, because then you can also, you know, those timelines can get connected with other timelines or other monies that could be out there. We're seeing a lot more funding come out from the province or the Fed and in other programming that isn't necessarily connected through ISK, that sometimes can be joint funded, or there's even municipal type agreements, right? How can you partner with municipalities? And then again, understanding how those things work, I think are all part of that structure. And it's not always straightforward. Actually, most of the time it's not straightforward at all. So I think, you know, just having that internal understanding of those things is really important. So when you engage a consultant or when you engage ISK, you can say, hey, no, I get it, but we're trying to look, you know, 6 months from now when I know this funding pocket opens, or I know that the local municipality or the local city that, you know, the nearby city that we have a relationship with are actually planning to do this. So that's why it's important to have those, you know, open conversations and understand, hey, you know, instead of saying, hey, I missed it because, you know, banking day closed, or, you know, our regional planning structure, you know, just happened. So now we have to wait till next year, or next month, or, next quarter. You can say, no, we're on top of it. And, everyone that we need to be on board understands it. So when you do submit something, it kind of has support from all levels and understanding, so that you're not spending 2-3 months explaining it and you're kind of pushing that deadline. When you dump, when you submit everything on the deadline, everyone's like, hey, all the boxes are checked. So I think that's an important part too.
Understanding the process that's involved to get an infrastructure project through. I mean, there's recognition that once you do figure out the process, then you're good to go, but it can take communities a long time, and you may lose that capacity because you've got a lot of turnover for those that are trying to get through these major infrastructure projects. It's pretty hard not to talk about the funding piece when we start talking about infrastructure, because it just costs so much money. Part of the problem that I think we have is that, unlike housing, because you're literally living in a house, infrastructure is more detached from your everyday. So a pipe in the ground, or the water that flows out of a tap, or the roads that you drive on, or even, garbage and solid waste management. It's easier to be detached because it's, out of sight, out of mind. How much of a challenge do you think it is to reinforce the importance of infrastructure and this goes to non-Indigenous and Indigenous communities? How important is it to re-engage people with the importance of infrastructure and make that stronger link to health and well-being? Because I think it's, in some ways it's easy with things like water, less so maybe with the other assets. Do you view that as a challenge, in that we know infrastructure is important, we know it costs a lot of money, but the importance placed on it is maybe lower than it should be? Heather?
I think definitely. And especially with small communities, you probably only get a large water project, or a large school, or a large community center, once in a blue moon kind of thing. So it's you don't see that coming up time and time again if the infrastructure is done right. Even I don't want to say off reserve, but even across across the nation. Everyone takes for granted that turning on the taps, I'm getting water, or the road to my house should be paved, or whatnot. So it is very, very important, but very, like you say, very hidden. So some of the opportunities for that is that when you're looking for and Kear had said it earlier, it's like, how do you learn from each other so that you don't have to start from scratch? How can you share drawings or share ideas or whatnot more readily? And I think Kear said it earlier, like, we collect a lot of data. How is that data shared? Not necessarily, and is it the right data that we're collecting? So in this new environment, how can that be a little bit more collaborative, rather than, hey, I'm collecting data, ISC is collecting data just for its own sake and are reporting upwards, rather than reporting outward to other communities to help them kind of go through the process, which a community would only do like once in a lifetime sort of thing.
Right.
Yeah, I think for me, it comes from a lack of representation within the technical field. So, I'm just finishing my master's right now. And one of the reasons I went in to do my master's is because there's this big gap in information that's available for on-reserve housing and Indigenous housing. Like, it's from a research and technical standpoint. And so it's similar, I think, in this situation where, maybe that lack of understanding, or, because we don't have very many Indigenous engineers and technical staff, really broadly speaking, that you don't have somebody advocating for a paved road, right? Or you don't say, yeah, this is important, but what does a paved road do for the community? And that broader understanding of how that infrastructure could benefit, right? It's similar where if everyone's on septic and you're just like, well, nothing's wrong, right? Everything's flushing, everything seems fine. Why would we upgrade to better treatment. But the better treatment allows, more density, or allows a broader access to just that infrastructure, and allows much better planning, I guess, in the future. And that's why I think it's really important to build that capacity and try to influence your people or other Indigenous people to come in and provide that project management or that engineering stuff, because they can actually say, hey, yeah, this other, just like Heather said, this other community accessed this, and maybe they didn't need sidewalks, so they, at the end of it, they said, we applied and we got money, or maybe we paid for extra sidewalks, and we wouldn't do that again, because we find that our people are not necessarily using the sidewalk because just the way our community is. But then there's other communities who have made partnerships with local non-Indigenous communities to put sidewalks in, because it's a safety reason for some of those roads. So really understanding and getting that local knowledge to be able to get that feedback. And I do think it's important to report out so that everyone understands that, and we can celebrate the successes, and then we can look at those challenges to be able to see how we can not make those mistakes like in similar communities, I think.
Right. I think that's a good a place for us to sort of segue into some of the opportunities. I think there's probably no shortage of experience from everyone listening into the webinar and the communities that we engage with on the challenges of infrastructure. One of the biggest ones being that many First Nations aren't even at the starting gate with their infrastructure. There's a lot of work that needs to be done, a lot of funding that needs to be pushed towards it. We're constantly talking about that building capacity piece. I'm wondering if when we talk about the creation of a new authority, and because our engagements have really focused on sort of what's not working, we're trying to transition now to talk about what could work, what might work, and what should be in place in a new authority. Maybe we can shift now to what the opportunities might be around infrastructure with the new authority. So we've talked a bit about building capacity, starting early in terms of getting more First Nations engaged in science, technology, engineering, and math, for example, such that it leads to careers where you're more engaged in that later on. But Heather, I'm wondering if you can comment a little bit about what you think the opportunities are. Obviously, having worked in this space for some time, knowing what works and what doesn't work, where there's challenges, where do you think there's a great opportunity for the authority around infrastructure?
I think the biggest thing is how do you work on the partnerships? Because like we said earlier, like we collect a lot of data, and there's a little bit of a proprietary piece, and it's not so easy for us to say here we have all these designs that we can share out. We'd have to we've got to go back to the community and ask them if they're able to share it, and they've got to ask maybe their engineering firm to share it. So how do we build those partnerships? And we mentioned that, because of the number of small communities that we have here, what are some of the economies of scale? We talked about, the chief and council they've got, so many other things to do. And a lot of them rely a lot on their consultants to, apply or, do the research for their infrastructure projects. So how can we build that capacity back in the community? It's, how do we grow that economy, that infrastructure, that technology economy within the nations themselves without relying too much? And I don't want to say you have to cut out all the consultants. It's just like, how do you share in the wealth of infrastructure projects? So can this organization be some sort of, repository of knowledge, skills, and technical expertise for communities to reach into, at their own way to be able to promote their own communities' priorities. So we don't want cookie cutter infrastructure in all First Nations. We want them to have their own culture and their own geographic influences. but how do you condense that and have some sort of economies of scale is perhaps an opportunity. I mean, it's really up to each community to determine what their priorities are. And how do we build, you know, again, back to the differing priorities. Our first priority is maintaining existing infrastructure. But we're not really building for growth at this point in time. You know, we look at that in terms of projection, but how do we build for tomorrow? And looking at not just replacing the existing assets, but how do we grow into our communities to make them actually better rather than just maintaining the existing asset to its current standard.
Yeah, those are great points. Kear, do you want to speak a little bit about where you think there's some opportunities for the new authority around infrastructure?
Yeah, I think some of what Heather said resonates with me. I think the new council, the Housing Infrastructure Council, does have an opportunity to be a hub. You know, a hub that's controlled and gets feedback and changes with the needs of the communities. And I think that's really the opportunity here is to look at, you know, what's historically worked and what historically hasn't worked, and giving your feedback and finding those synergies and those economies of scale that may not be possible with the current system. Because it's connected with a much larger bureaucracy, and I think that's the major opportunity. And I think what happens is when you start looking at, you know, having a hub or having more representation or say in this field, that you can find other synergies with other organizations out there. So there could be, you know, more partnerships at universities so that we can, you know, pump out more research and understand that without necessarily, you know, making a whole new department and all the efficiencies that bureaucracy takes. We could actually just connect that and maybe some of the information systems to these other institutions who specialize in that. So we could say, hey, this is how things have changed over the last 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, and this is why we're guiding it this way now. Because, you know, as funding changes and as priorities change, we can have those partnerships to allow for greater guidance, I guess, in those, to say, yeah, we're moving in this direction because these things say this, and then maybe we're moving in that direction because it's a political thing, and this is the feedback that we've been having. And, you know, so it's not just, you know, one big political check mark that is pushing funding, but more control on that side. And I really think, you know, by having an Indigenous housing and infrastructure organization that can guide that work, that you can say, hey, you know what, like Uncle Bob works for, you know, this department, and you could work into that, right? It's very generational for me. You know, my daughter's 9 years old, and, you know, she sees me, you know, studying, or she sees me working, or I bring her to the office. And that innately will give her that ability or that perspective to say, hey, I could maybe be an engineer. And I think those are the other things that this really does build, and is actually quite exciting for me, is to have those people in those roles, recognizing them in the communities. And you're not just having, you know, a lot of outside consultants coming in and doing what they, you know, what they do and what they're paid to do, and you know, but having that broader scale and saying, hey, you know, Uncle Bob is, maybe he's away from the community for a week on, week off, because maybe his area is bigger, but when he's in the community, he's going to the community dinners, right? He's showing up, talking with elders and doing things that, because it's he's part of the community and it's part of his culture, that he just happens to work in that industry, that shows that, instead of, again, flying in some guys from you don't know where who are there to do a specific job. And it's not that they're, you know, they're bad or that they don't want to be part of that. They're not, it's not necessarily part of their culture and part of their everyday to sit down in some of those meetings or some of those community things. So just giving broader access and broader perspective to people within the communities and building that capacity, I think generations from now, not necessarily tomorrow.
Right. Those are great points, I think, in terms of thinking bigger than sometimes when we talk about just sort of taking over programs and services, you still live under that umbrella or that box that limits you from thinking, you know, big picture, which is that often our approach has been so reactionary, and the new authority really needs to be thinking long-term, really proactive, really bigger picture about how you create something greater than just, you know, one isolated program or piece. And something that kind of brings communities together, because they're often pitted against each other in these sort of competitive funding processes. And that doesn't encourage innovation, doesn't encourage that collaboration piece. So those are some great points. I really appreciate it. I'm cognizant of the time, and I do want to give an opportunity for a good discussion about urban. I want to remind those watching that this is meant to just be a bit of an intro to the conversations that we're having in our engagement sessions. It's not the first time we're talking about infrastructure. It definitely won't be the last time. There'll be lots of other opportunities to share your perspectives on infrastructure in our engagement sessions and other opportunities. But maybe just in the last 30 seconds, 1 minute for us, if you want to just share any parting words on how you feel about infrastructure with the new authority, and then we'll transition over to urban housing. But I'll start by thanking you, each of you, for sharing your perspective. So Heather, thanks for joining us this morning. Any final thoughts?
No, thanks for having me. And I mean, like we said earlier, the new authority can take any or all of these, what our existing processes, and change them. So it really is think big and look at what you want to do for the long term. So thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Heather. Kear, any final thoughts?
Yeah, thanks for having me too. I really look forward to working with you guys and communities going forward. I think one of the big things here is we get to try to create something from scratch, and it's, you know, often when you see systems that maybe aren't working as good as they could, I think looking at a totally different way of creating something rather than just kind of amending something or trying to slightly change a system, that this is an opportunity to do it in a way that fits, rather than trying to make, you know, a square peg fit into a round hole, right?
Great points. Thanks so much for both of you for those perspectives. I want to take the opportunity now to switch over to urban housing. So I'm going to pass it back to our lead here, Jeff Laux, and pass the baton over. So thanks for joining us on the infrastructure chat, and over to you, Jeff.
Thanks, Carrie. And to both Kear and Heather, as Carrie said, thank you. Don't go away, because I've been monitoring the questions that have been coming in. There are a number of questions on the infrastructure piece, so please stay around. To all of those people who are on the webinar this morning, I do want to apologize up front for the delay in getting started. And as a result, because of that, we're probably going to go over our time. We hope to be done in about an hour, but around the top of the hour, we're already going to probably exceed, not probably, we will exceed that timeline. So I hope that you have the time. Please stay around, and we'll go through the Q&As, and we'll answer as many of those questions as we can. Let's start with the conversation about the housing for those folks who live away. By the way, folks who are using the chat, we don't always see the chat. Use the Q&A section, if you will, for any specific questions or comments you want to make, and I can make sure that those get to the presenters as we go through the rest of the session. So our next speaker has been able to join us. It's Michael Sadler. Michael, if you want to open your screen so we can all see you, that would be great. Number of people probably know Michael Sadler from his work with BC Housing and from his work with a variety of organizations around the province. But we'll introduce Michael formally, and then get a chance to hear from him as to some of his thoughts. This session is about, as I mentioned earlier, about how we integrate both the on and off portion of housing and infrastructure, and how we make that work for both parts of this under the new authority. And hopefully in the conversation that we're about to have with Michael, we can understand some of that from his perspective. Michael is a member of the Kispiox First Nation, the Gitxsan people of, in northern BC near Hazelton. He holds a bachelor's and a master's degree in education, and has been an instructor in various post-secondary institutions in the areas of teaching development and Indigenous social issues. He has worked as the CEO, as an executive director, and as a director in both regional and provincial organizations in the area of Indigenous education. And as I mentioned right now, he works for BC Housing. So I'm going to turn it over to Michael, give him an opportunity to say a few words and to talk to you about what's on his mind. And then I have a few questions that I'm going to pose to him, and hopefully we get a chance to answer. For anybody who is wondering, because of the mics, etc., I've seen a few questions around that. All participants, all the attendees' mics should be muted. And the only ones that would be open right now would be myself and Michael's. So if you're wondering why you don't have a microphone, it's because we muted you. Anyways, Michael, would you like to start?
Yeah, sorry. First of all, sorry for being late. Second of all, sorry for, it seems my video is not working. It's saying something about being occupied by other apps. So you don't get to see me. I don't know if you want to see me anyways, but we'll try and do this without video, which I think should work. So hopefully people can hear me. So yeah, thanks, Jeff, and thanks for allowing me to participate. I'm coming to you from North Vancouver, which is the traditional territory of the Squamish Nation and Tsleil-Waututh Nation. I've lived on the North Shore for about 15 years. Jeff gave a bit of an intro of who I am, and many of you, or some of you may know, I currently work for BC Housing, and I've been there for about 5 years. And I have to admit, before I went to work there, I didn't really know much about BC Housing, which kind of is a good segue into the topic that we're going to talk about, which is urban housing. So, you know, obviously the first thing that I learned about was the number of Indigenous housing providers providing housing to our people off nation, and there's currently approximately about 40 of those organizations, and they're scattered around throughout British Columbia, and have done a really outstanding job at providing much needed lower income housing for our people. We know that a lot of the off reserve housing is located in larger urban centers, but we're seeing also more and more housing providers become involved in some of our smaller areas as well. Unfortunately, our people make up a large number of people in social housing, and there's a whole bunch of historical reasons for that, as we're all well aware. You know, I think just the issue of housing affordability is touching everyone at all income levels, and so it's an issue that needs to be discussed, and it also does transcend First Nations as well. I know I'm on a steering committee or a task force with the district in North Vancouver, and they're very obviously concerned about affordable housing as well, because you know they're seeing that teachers and paramedics and health professionals and middle income earners can't afford to live in the areas that they work. So it's a topic that is getting parties elected, and it's on the tip of everyone's tongue.
Thank you, Michael. I'm going to start our conversation here with a series of questions, and I would ask that maybe what we can do here is try to get your thoughts on some of this, because somebody's asked this question earlier about over the years the problems that have been created about the way that housing has been delivered, both on First Nations and off First Nations. Has basically been delivered in two silos, through the federal government, through ISK or Indian Affairs, whichever we want to call it, and then through provincial programs or CMHC delivering off territory. So what are some of the obstacles, if you can speak to those, but some of the obstacles that this relationship has created for First Nations?
Well, I think we've already heard in the first part of the webinar about one of the obstacles, and that's infrastructure and the challenges that we have around infrastructure and the lack of funding. And I hate to talk about funding right off the bat, but we know that's one of the things that's needed. It's always needed, and so infrastructure is definitely one of those. And just having information about who's doing what in terms of creating services where you can put affordable housing, especially on nations. So I think that's definitely one area. I think also that we need to have some reliable data as well, and so we need to know things like if you're taking a look at Indigenous housing off nation, if there's a high percentage of Indigenous people in social housing off nation, then where are these people coming from? Are they coming from the local First Nations? Is it a large percentage of people coming from local First Nations, or are they coming from other provinces and territories? And so what is that makeup? And that's important to know because for many of the chiefs that I've talked to around the province over the last 5 years and working with BC Housing, many of them are saying, I don't care where my people live, I'm going to help them find housing. And that's really important because they know that there are housing challenges on nation. There's a shortage on nation, plus they know that some of the housing is substandard. And people also need to go to larger urban centers for a variety of different reasons, like health or education or employment opportunities, which may not exist in some of their nations or may not allow them to live on nation. So we're starting to see more of that. So I think there seems to be a bit of a lack of communication or a communication obstacle sometimes once you leave the nation. And I think we're all aware that government has created these silos, and that's just how funding comes down, unfortunately. And we need to create partnerships with all of the people and all of the government groups that are involved in providing housing. We need to do a lot more talking, maybe synergizing the funding and the capacity building and some of the initiatives as well. And we're starting to do that, and I think that's one of the goals of the First Nations Housing and Infrastructure Council is to start looking at ways and means of doing that. So I think it's timely that that they're coming to fruition and becoming another player with regards to housing in British Columbia.
So if we take down these silos that have been created, and we look at ways in which we can basically create opportunities to ensure that our people do not fall through the cracks, that they have better mobility moving on and off reserve. What are some of the ways then that you mentioned one about the authority, but what are some of the ways that both urban and well, not urban, but on nation, off nation peoples can work together to ensure that doesn't happen?
I think one of the first things that needs to happen is there needs to be relationships and partnerships developed between the off-nation housing providers and the on-nation. I know some of the Indigenous housing providers in the urban centers have good working relationships with the surrounding nations, but I believe that there are some that they're operating in their own silos, and I think those need to be eliminated. We need to create some partnerships and relationships there. We need to talk to each other. So when we first started working on nation, and BC Housing is the first provincial organization to take their funding on nation, we started meeting with a lot of First Nations. That's how we came up with the desire to do that. And one of the first things we ask is, do you have a relationship with the local housing providers, either Métis or First Nations, who are providing housing solutions to Indigenous people in the urban centers? And we were hearing a lot of times that no, they didn't have relationships. And so if they, for example, if they had a need for elders housing, and there were some projects being run off reserve that they didn't know about them. And so they could find placements almost immediately in some cases if they had those relationships. So the same with say women and children affected by violence, and we know that's a bit of an issue in our communities as well. And so there are opportunities there, and we've got safe houses in our women's transition house program scattered throughout the province as well. And so I think there needs to be a lot more communication between on nation and off nation housing.
Okay, good. Well, you touched on what will be my last question to you, and then I'm going to go to the participants, or sorry, to the attendees on the webinar and some of the questions that they've been posing. So this question deals more with what you just talked about with respect to BC Housing and that unique situation that BC Housing finds itself in a way that it is approaching housing on nation, different than anywhere else in Canada. So what, for you in doing this, what are some of the challenges that BC Housing is having as it pursues these projects on nation?
Yeah, we've run into a few challenges, and I'll be the first to say that we went into this very quickly. We didn't think it through entirely because we knew that the need was great. So back in 2017 when we created Building BC and decided to go on nation, we were really in many ways flying by the seat of our pants. And the reason for that was because we wanted to get money into our communities and housing built. And so we figured that we'd learn along the way. Well, one of the first things that we learned is especially the way that we fund our housing is through mortgages, and our ability to hang a mortgage on land that is not really owned by the First Nation, but it's Crown land. So land tenure was one of the biggest challenges that we faced. We think that we've got at least 4 or 5 different scenarios, and that's the other thing is that we needed to understand the very diverse situations on nation. Some want to use ministerial loan guarantees, some don't. Some don't want to use land designation. Some are treaty, some are self-governing, some have land codes, some don't. So we feel that we've come up with a bit of a matrix now where we can pretty much secure our mortgages on any different type of situation on nation. So that was one of the biggest challenges that we had. The second biggest one, probably, and I already mentioned that, was infrastructure and the need for infrastructure. And Heather's used to me throwing her under the bus and ISK under the bus, and ISK is an easy target. But there is just a lack of funding for sure. If ISK is most of their infrastructure funding goes to water treatment, and water treatment definitely is needed. That doesn't leave very much for infrastructure, for roads and sewer and water and electrical and things. So we need to get more finances into the system. So infrastructure definitely was one of the challenges. And then the last one probably was capacity building. So we've spent quite a bit of time with the nation's building capacity with them around how to really start digging into housing and all the things that are needed there. And I think that's been one of the biggest challenges. And there's some nations that have lucked out and they've got really great housing people. Others, people just don't have the skill set to be able to effectively do housing in their nation. So capacity building is also definitely one of the areas that I see that have some challenges.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm sorry that we weren't able to get sorted out. Or sorry, your video sorted out, but we'll hopefully everybody was able to listen and hear what you had to say. So thank you for that. I'm going to ask both Heather and Kear to come back on the screen so we can see you, because we've had a number of questions come in. And Carrie, you might want to come back on as well, because I know that you have some insight to this. Some of the questions I actually have to deal with what we intend to do within the authority. And I would say to some of the folks that are asking that, what will the authority do? How will it address this, that, or something else? some of those questions we can't answer today. That's the point for having these kind of conversations, and it's the point for engaging in what we call the regional engagement sessions, is to gain that kind of input and feedback from the First Nations, directly from the communities, and to give us that kind of insight and that kind of direction as to how we can create an authority that addresses some of the very concerns that are being expressed here. So the one question, and because everybody touched on this issue of infrastructure, and basically how to address it. How do you address future maintenance on those communities that are small communities that may have financial issues with a small population? How would you see addressing that kind of need and that kind of an issue? And I'm going to ask first Kear and then Michael. Kear, how would you see this whole issue of infrastructure in small areas and being able to maintain those services and financially support them?
Yeah, I think, you know, as you make these funding applications, looking around and seeing what kind of resources are available with nearby communities, if there are nearby communities, I think is key. And having somebody within the community trained up, so, or even more than one person, I think is important, you know. So, you know, if the project, let's say, is a 2-year project, that you identify somebody even before the shovels go into the ground, or a few people, send them out to get training, get them involved with the project and understanding, and that they can build those skills during the project, and then be able to take that into the, you know, as the project's finished, and provide that operations and maintenance. I know it's easier said than done. Some communities don't have people. Some, you know, so that's where I think going outside of the community sometimes to find somebody, whether it's in another Indigenous community or whether it's in a nearby non-Indigenous community, I think having those local resources is super, super important to be able to maintain and operate, you know, whatever that looks like. And so taking that educational piece and really engaging and asking those questions, I think is part of that for me.
Okay, thank you. Carrie, I'm going to get you to jump in on this, because the point's been made that we've done research, we've done studies, we've done a lot of this work already in trying to assess the nature and the scope of the problem. In the one question the person asked, they said over the past 10 years, I've been doing this now for over 35, almost 40 years. And sometimes when I hear other conversations like this, I think I've heard this conversation before. I think I've read that report. I think I've seen that data, that kind of thing. So the question, I guess, basis for us as a new authority, as we go to create that, Kear's talked about how to maybe address the smaller issues around capacity. Michael talked about capacity. But what is the new authority looking at to try and to ensure that dollars get out to address the infrastructure needs, and that we're able to respond to the First Nations needs on a long-term basis, as opposed to just addressing, you know, current issues, current concerns?
Yeah, it's a great point. And, you know, to the point that, you know, we've heard this before. If you're having deja vu right now, that's normal. We have had this conversation before, but we haven't necessarily done anything about it. That being said, we've asked a lot of questions. We've collected a lot of data over the past 10, 15 years. We haven't done anything with it, nor is that data really fulsome. We have no clear picture of exactly how big the infrastructure gap is in First Nations communities in BC. We have no sense of it. We can estimate, we can guess. The reports that, you know, are generated are best guesses, best estimates. Even all of the data that we do collect, it still has gaps. It's still missing some of those pieces. And so the new authority needs to have a really keen understanding of that piece. That assessment has to dive deeper and bigger. And it can't just be about assets. It needs to be about the bigger picture of what's needed to support that. With respect to the funding piece, though, the question of how is a new authority going to fund these projects? How is that piece going to be transparent? How are companies going to know exactly where money is being spent? Transparency is one of the key terms that comes out in every single engagement process. Whatever you do, be transparent about it. Have the new authority be transparent about it. There's also the recognition that there is no amount of money that we can identify right now and we'll be able to pluck out of the sky and solve all First Nations infrastructure issues. That's just a reality. I think that's even truer now post-COVID. The focus has been post-pandemic on building resilience. That requires money and that requires sustainable infrastructure. Unfortunately, those are huge issues in First Nations communities. So we have to be thinking about getting the right data, really understanding the need in First Nations, not just to bring them up to par to the critical infrastructure piece, but also in the long-term perspective. So this is what I need to be sort of at par or at the starting gate. Then there's the question of climate change and adaptability and long-term resilience. That's a whole nother innovation piece that we have to invest in. There's multiple layers that need investment. We need to be clear about that. We need to set expectations. The new authority really has to have a handle on what the need is, and then it needs to figure out ways to be transparent about getting funding to communities, and then about connecting communities with alternative funding programs, because there isn't enough money out there to fund the infrastructure need. Some of the pieces like the Carbon Forest Alliance project in the West Coast, where they utilize funding from other sources to help funnel it into infrastructure pieces. The new authority is going to have to be thinking big picture about all of those pieces, but the data need is huge, the understanding around the dollars is huge, and then how the new authority integrates all of that and becomes transparent is a need for us to figure out how to do that, or how the new authority is going to do that.
Thank you. I'm cognizant, sorry, was that Heather? Do you want to?
And just maybe one of the things that we've heard on that is that, you know, because of the small communities, one or two people are wearing several hats. So when we're thinking about the new authority, you know, what are the services, like Carrie said, what are the services and programs that they could potentially take over? And, you know, while we only have circuit rider for just water, is there an opportunity to do kind of a roving project manager or a circuit rider for all the other assets too, where, you know, you can't really have one per every 200 communities, but maybe there's a core group or a service that the authority can take over and then, you know, go to each community's, you know, in a cycle or as needed, or, you know, as a fee for service, whatever sort of thing. So that could be an opportunity to use kind of the limited money. So rather than giving, hey, you know, $5,000 per community for a housing a housing inspector, could there be something more central and providing that service? So is this an opportunity or an idea to maybe think about from a service delivery piece?
Thank you for that. I'm going to ask the last question to Michael, and then I'm going to apologize to all those people who are asking questions. We're almost 10 minutes over what was our allotted time. I intended to ask permission of both yourselves and the presenters, the guests we have today, that permission to extend past that 2 o'clock, or sorry, 2 o'clock my time, past the 11 o'clock deadline in BC. So my hope is there are still people that are with us and still interested in this conversation. There are a number of questions that remain, and we'll get to them all. But Michael, I wanted to take the last one to you because there's two or three that sort of fit together. And this whole question around what is harmonization? What does it look like to harmonize both on and off nation? Especially when you have, and I sit on council in my home community, a large portion of our citizens live away. We term it live away, that are not in the community, that need housing and need other services. But there's also a huge need in the community on nation. Leadership has to balance both of those challenges. And as Carrie mentioned earlier, there's a limited amount of dollars and there's a limited amount of places we can go to get that. So when we talk about harmonization and the approach that you were talking about earlier with BC Housing, what does that look like, and how do we address the issues and challenges that exist at a leadership level in trying to address both the needs of those people who live in the community on nation and those for whom all leadership has said that we've never abdicated our responsibility for those citizens who live away? How do we bring those two things together, and how do we satisfy both sides of that coin?
The best way I can answer that question is to provide an example or a couple of examples. The first is that I'm working with a group in the northwest part of the province, and they started off as the Tsimshian Alliance, and they formed because of some funding that came out through LNG, and they've now sort of morphed into a more solidified group, and they've got a table specifically to deal with housing. And so that's about 8 nations in the Northwest, and they're hoping to get more nations involved. And so they meet now on a regular basis to discuss housing both on and off nation. And they've got sort of the golden triangle up there, which is Terrace, Prince Rupert, and Kitimat. And they know that a lot of their people are living in all 3 of those urban centers. And they need to have opportunities and create opportunities for housing for them, for employment, education, health, whatever. And so they're in the process now of developing a bit of a strategy around housing for both on nation and off nation, and create relationships and partnerships with the key players like BC Housing, ISK, and CMHC, but also with the local municipalities. I think they're also a very key component to this. Because they have some of the land, they've got some of the infrastructure funding, so and zoning bylaws, so on and so forth. So they play a critical component there too. So I think by that group coming together to discuss that, I think there's strength in numbers. And I know funders definitely like to see that too. Just to Kear mentioned economies of scale, so you're able to get that. And I know that there's another group in the Stalo territories, and another that we're working with in the Cranbrook area, the Tunaha, who are also interested in working in this manner. And it basically has to happen. And I think that's one of the ways that that definitely can work. And so I know that, Jeff, I've mentioned those groups to you before, and I think that it's I'd like to see those types of groups formed in all parts of the province, maybe 4 to 5 other areas of the province.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to end it there, and I apologize to all of our participants and to all of those who attended. I thank everybody for staying on and being patient with us. Our apologies for that earlier glitch, and it's delayed us as we went through the session today. So I want to thank you for that. A few reminders, if I can, just before we close out. The webinars that we hold here now are just part of our whole phase 3 engagement process. The next webinar is set for September 22nd. You can register for that now. The subject of that one will be funding and finance, a topic that I'm sure will interest a lot of people. So if you're interested in that, you can start and go to our website and register for that one now on the 22nd. But we will be following up these webinar sessions with regional engagement sessions. And there's more information on that by just contacting the regional engagement coordinators. They will be out reaching out to all of the various communities and letting you know when those start. But there is a regional engagement session scheduled for September 16th at 10 a.m. And if you want to register for that, you just go to engagement@fnhic-bc.ca. And if I said that too fast, just go to our website. It'll be on the website and you can get the information you need. We welcome you to participate in these regional engagement sessions. They're important in order for us to make sure that we can engage with you more closely, more on a smaller level, and engage with you more personally to get the information that we need and to be able to help us as we move forward with this work we're on. There will be a follow-up survey to today's webinar. Normally it comes on the screen here at the end, but we'll also send it out to everybody in a follow-up email, and we would appreciate your feedback. We need to hear what you have to tell us as to how this works and how best to make it work, and anything that we need to do. But it will be shared with you. I mentioned that all of the questions that you ask, we will attempt to answer all of them. So anything that's been asked or is on the Q&A session, we will get to them, and you will be able to go to our website and be able to see the response with each of the webinars that have been held over the last little while. So with that, I want to say thank you very much to Kear, to Heather, to Carrie, and to Michael for the time that they took today to be part of this. I want to thank all of those people who attended and took time out and stuck with us here for the little extra length of time that this one took. The poll survey is popped up on the screen, now. You're welcome to go ahead and fill it in now. But we hope to see you here on the 22nd for the session on funding and finance. And we thank everybody for your time. It's really important to have people like Kear and Heather and Michael take the time out of their busy schedule to be here, share their thoughts and share their ideas. And we appreciate that. And Heather, we let you off the hook, but you can bet, you know, we've got a lot to say over the coming months and weeks or whatever, as we discuss this with our friends at ISC. So thanks very much, everybody. Thanks for being part of this, and we'll see you again in a couple of weeks. Bye for now.